1/5 of Russia's entire seaborne oil exports, 1/3 of its grain exports, and, as of late July, 0 tankers loaded for 4 straight days at the terminal that handles both. Novorossiysk was supposed to be Russia's answer to everything we've documented across this series. The port it retreated its navy to after Sevastopol became unsurvivable, the terminal that kept oil revenue flowing even as the Black Sea Fleet trapped itself inside the harbor, the one place left that was supposed to still function normally. It isn't functioning normally anymore. It hasn't been, really, for months. And the pace of attacks on it has been accelerating specifically over the past several weeks, in ways that connect directly to almost every single thread we've pulled on this channel so far. We've mentioned Novorossiysk in nearly every naval episode we've made, as the port Russia's fleet retreated to, as the harbor where a submarine got struck by an underwater drone at its own pier, as the base a Russian commander may be removed over. Today we're looking at Novorossiysk itself, as its own story, because what's been happening there over just the past 4 months represents one of the most sustained, multi-domain assaults on a single piece of infrastructure this entire war has produced, hitting the port's naval assets, its oil terminals, its tankers, and its onshore fuel depots, sometimes within days of each other, in a pattern that makes clear this isn't occasional harassment. It's a deliberate, ongoing siege of the one facility Russia can least afford to lose. Let's establish exactly what's at Novorossiysk, because the scale of what's concentrated in this single port is what makes the sustained campaign against it so consequential. This is Russia's largest port on the Black Sea, and its most important oil export hub, bar none, handling roughly 1/5 of the country's entire seaborne crude oil exports through the Sheskharis terminal alone, a transshipment complex operated by Chernomortransneft that functions as the endpoint for Transneft's main pipeline network running out of Krasnodar Krai. Sitting alongside it is the Caspian Pipeline Consortium Terminal, which exports crude specifically from Kazakhstan and counts major Western oil companies, including Chevron and ExxonMobil, among its shareholders. A detail that adds a genuinely awkward international dimension to every strike that lands near it. And beyond oil, Novorossiysk handles roughly 1/3 of Russia's total grain exports, making it not just an energy choke point, but an agricultural one too. Layer onto all of that the naval dimension we covered in earlier episodes. This is also where what remains of Russia's Black Sea Fleet retreated to after Sevastopol became too dangerous to use. And you get a single port that's simultaneously Russia's most important oil terminal, one of its most important grain terminals, and its primary naval refuge in the entire theater. There is no equivalent single point of failure anywhere else in Russia's Black Sea infrastructure. Now let's walk through what's actually happened to that single point of failure just since the spring of this year, because the frequency alone tells a story. On April 6th, Ukrainian long-range drones struck the Sheskharis terminal directly, damaging critical infrastructure used to measure oil volume and quality and, more significantly, control valves responsible for regulating oil flow between the terminal's loading berths. Precise, technical damage aimed specifically at the systems that make a modern export terminal actually function, not just symbolic. Damage to a storage tank. That same overnight operation, according to Ukraine's drone forces commander Robert Brovdy, also targeted the Admiral Makarov missile carrier, one of the more significant surface combatants still operating out of the port. Connecting this directly to the naval degradation campaign we detailed in our episode on Russia's trapped Black Sea Fleet. Russian authorities confirmed at least 8 people injured in that strike, including 2 children, with drone debris falling across multiple locations in the city, including a residential district. Then came the Grushevaya Balka oil depot, a facility feeding directly into the Sheskharis transshipment system, and it's been hit with a regularity that's hard to characterize as anything other than a sustained, repeat target campaign. It was struck on May 23rd, with the resulting fire engulfing a significant portion of the facility and forcing firefighters to battle the blaze for days, using so much water in the process that nearby communities actually faced their own water shortages until supplies were eventually restored. It was struck again on the night of June 7th into 8th, with local residents reporting roughly 50 separate explosions before thick smoke rose above the storage facility. This is a depot roughly 12 kilometers outside Novorossiysk proper, in an area called Grushovia Balka beyond the Markot Ridge, meaning Ukrainian drones aren't just reaching the port itself, they're reaching supporting infrastructure well outside the city's immediate boundary, and hitting it repeatedly enough that Russia clearly hasn't found a way to adequately defend it between strikes. July brought an escalation that moved beyond fixed infrastructure entirely and started targeting the vessels themselves directly while they were in the act of loading. On July 19th, a drone struck a tanker while it was actively taking on crude at the CPC Marine Terminal near the village of Yuzhnaya Ozerievka, close to Novorossiysk, hitting the vessel's aft section, between the superstructure and the engine room, sparking a fire that took hours to extinguish, and forcing the evacuation of all 22 crew members, an international crew, aboard a tanker that ultimately remained afloat with no oil spill reported. Oil loading resumed that evening. Then, the very next day, July 20th, it happened again. A second attack on a civilian tanker at the exact same terminal within 48 hours, forcing loading operations to suspend once more. 2 strikes on tankers actively loading oil at the same terminal within 2 days of each other. That's not an isolated incident. That's a terminal that has become, functionally, an active combat zone for anyone operating a vessel inside it. And then the terminal simply stopped functioning altogether. Bloomberg reported, citing shipping data, satellite imagery, and vessel tracking services, that the Sheskharis terminal hadn't loaded a single tanker since the preceding Tuesday. A suspension, Bloomberg specifically noted, was unlikely to have been weather-related, since storm warnings for the region weren't issued until 2 days after the terminal's last loading operation had already stopped. Russia's largest Black Sea oil export terminal, responsible for roughly a fifth of the country's entire seaborne crude exports, simply went dark, not because of a single dramatic strike, but because the cumulative risk of operating it had become untenable enough that loading operations halted on their own. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a different and in some ways more significant kind of damage than a single explosion, however dramatic. We've talked across this series about Russia losing refining capacity, losing surface ships, losing submarines. This is Russia's most critical export terminal, choosing to simply stop operating on its own because the accumulated risk from repeated strikes on tankers, on control infrastructure, and on supporting depots had made continued operations too dangerous to sustain. Nobody had to sink the terminal. Ukraine just had to make operating it costly and unpredictable enough, consistently enough, that the terminal effectively took itself offline. There's a naval dimension layered on top of all of this economic damage too, and it connects the oil story directly back to the fleet story we spent an entire earlier episode documenting. Just days ago, Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed 2 Ukrainian unmanned surface boats attacked the Russian naval base at Novorossiysk itself, saying the boats were detected, fired on, and destroyed before reaching their target. A claim worth treating with the same skepticism we've applied to Russian battlefield claims throughout this series, given how consistently those claims have failed to hold up under independent scrutiny. What isn't in dispute is that residents heard explosions strong enough to set off car alarms in the nearby village of Yuzhnaya Ozerievka, and that a fire and a large plume of smoke rose visibly over the port's oil terminal in the aftermath. Russia introduced a temporary ban on vessel movement at the port following the incident. The CPC, which operates a terminal in the immediate area, said its own facility hadn't been damaged and continued loading, though local residents reportedly believed the explosion had actually occurred at the CPC terminal specifically, directly contradicting the company's own public statement. That gap between official reassurance and local eyewitness accounts is a pattern we've now documented so many times across this series that it barely needs separate explanation anymore. There's a retaliatory dimension to this story worth including too, because it shows this isn't a one-directional campaign happening in isolation from the rest of the war. The reported naval base attack near Novorossiysk in early August came just 2 days after Russia struck the Ukrainian port of Izmail in Odessa region. An attack that damaged a grain elevator, storage hangars, tanks at one of the port's cargo terminals, and production, warehouse, and administrative buildings. That timing is worth reading as more than coincidence. Izmail sits on the Danube, functioning as one of Ukraine's critical alternative grain export routes, since the Black Sea's main shipping lanes became too contested to rely on consistently. Meaning Russia's strike there wasn't a random act of destruction, but a targeted attempt to damage the same category of infrastructure Ukraine keeps hitting at Novorossiysk. Both sides, in other words, have converged on the same basic strategic insight. Grain and oil export infrastructure is a legitimate, high-value target precisely because damaging it inflicts economic pain that compounds over months, in a way a single battlefield engagement rarely does on its own. Neither side has been shy about applying that logic to the other's ports. The Kazakhstan angle deserves specific attention too, because it's a reminder that Ukraine's pressure campaign against Novorossiysk carries consequences that extend well beyond Russia's own war economy. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal exports crude that originates almost entirely in Kazakhstan, not Russia, meaning every disruption at this specific facility, whether from a tanker strike or a full loading suspension, directly reduces Kazakhstan's own ability to get its oil to international buyers, despite Kazakhstan having no direct role in this war at all. Reporting on the terminal's disruptions has specifically noted that the attacks have forced Kazakhstan to reduce its own oil production as a downstream consequence. An uncomfortable reality that complicates any simple narrative about this campaign only affecting Russia. Major Western oil companies with financial stakes in the CPC terminal, including Chevron and ExxonMobil, are similarly exposed to disruptions they have no ability to prevent and no direct connection to the war causing them. That's a genuinely awkward set of collateral consequences for a campaign otherwise aimed squarely at degrading Russian war financing, and it's worth naming honestly rather than glossing over for the sake of a cleaner narrative about this pressure campaign only hurting Moscow. There's also a technical dimension to the April strike worth returning to, because the specific infrastructure damaged tells you something about how sophisticated Ukraine's targeting has become at this specific facility. Hitting systems used to measure oil volume and quality, along with the control valves regulating flow between loading berths, isn't the kind of damage you inflict by accident or through indiscriminate targeting. It requires detailed knowledge of how a modern export terminal's control systems are actually laid out. Which buildings house metering equipment? Where valve control stations sit relative to the loading berths themselves? And which specific components, if disabled, create the most operational disruption relative to the physical size of the target being struck? That same strike also reportedly damaged a launcher belonging to Russia's S-400 air defense system stationed to protect the port. Meaning Ukraine wasn't just hitting economic infrastructure in that operation, it was simultaneously degrading the very air defense assets meant to prevent exactly this kind of strike from succeeding again in the future. Weakening the shield while damaging the target it's supposed to protect in the same overnight operation is a level of coordinated planning that fits the broader pattern of increasingly sophisticated Ukrainian deep strike operations we've documented developing steadily across this entire series, of sustained pressure on a single facility across just 4 months. Control infrastructure damaged in April, a missile carrier targeted the same night, a supporting oil depot hit in May and again in June, 2 tankers struck mid-loading on consecutive days in July, the entire terminal suspending operations days later, and a naval base attack reported at the start of August. That's not a random scattering of unrelated incidents. That's a single port under what amounts to continuous, rotating pressure across every category of targeted hosts: naval, oil infrastructure, tankers in transit, and supporting depots, with barely a month going by without some new strike landing somewhere inside its perimeter. It's worth connecting this back to the broader economic campaign we've documented across multiple earlier episodes, because Novorossiysk sits at the intersection of nearly every thread this channel has pulled on so far. We covered, several episodes back, how Russia lost roughly a quarter of its petrol production capacity through the refinery strikes reaching Omsk and Salavat. Novorossiysk isn't a refinery. It's the export point for crude that's already been refined elsewhere or is being shipped out in raw form. But disrupting it produces an economically related effect through a different mechanism entirely. It doesn't matter how much crude Russia can still pull out of the ground, or even how much refined product it can still produce, if the single largest terminal responsible for actually getting a fifth of that oil onto ships and out to paying customers keeps suspending operations. This is the export choke point sitting downstream of the production choke point we documented earlier. Hit the refineries, and Russia has less to sell. Hit Novorossiysk, and Russia struggles to actually sell what it does still have, regardless of how much is sitting in storage tanks waiting to move. The grain dimension deserves equal attention, because it's easy to let the oil story dominate given how much of this series has focused on Russia's energy revenue specifically. Novorossiysk handling roughly a third of Russia's total grain exports means every disruption here has the same kind of ripple effect into global food markets we discussed when covering the Kerch Strait closure several episodes back, except this time affecting Russia's own grain trade directly, rather than the grain moving through occupied Ukrainian territory via the Sea of Azov. Russia has spent much of this war trying to use its own agricultural exports as a source of stable, sanctions-resistant revenue, precisely because grain doesn't carry the same kind of Western price cap restrictions oil does. A terminal handling a third of that trade going dark, even temporarily, undercuts one of the few genuinely reliable revenue streams Moscow has left that isn't already under direct Western sanctions pressure. There's a global oil market dimension worth folding in here too, because Novorossiysk's troubles don't stay contained to a regional story about one port on Russia's southern coast. Al Jazeera's reporting on the April strike specifically noted that Ukraine has significantly intensified attacks on Russia's energy facilities across both the Baltic and Black Sea theaters simultaneously, targeting the largest oil exporting hubs in each region as part of a coordinated effort to reduce Moscow's oil sales revenue overall, not just its Black Sea-specific export capacity. That's worth connecting to something we've referenced across several earlier episodes about the scale of Russia's shadow fleet and its dependence on maintaining steady export volumes to keep revenue flowing despite Western price caps. A country trying to protect two major export coastlines simultaneously, using air defense and naval assets that are already stretched thin defending ground offensives in Donetsk, and a submarine fleet that's already lost half its Black Sea strength, faces a resource allocation problem with no clean solution. Every additional S-400 battery or naval patrol asset committed to defending Novorossiysk specifically is one fewer available for the Baltic terminals facing a parallel campaign, and vice versa. This is the same strategic squeeze we've documented Russia facing across nearly every domain this series has covered. Not one overwhelming, singular threat, but many simultaneous, moderate ones that collectively exceed what Russia's available defensive resources can adequately cover everywhere at once. It's worth stepping back, too, and asking what actually changes for Russia's broader war effort if a facility this significant keeps operating at reduced, unpredictable capacity rather than being knocked out entirely. Because that's the more realistic outcome than a clean, permanent shutdown, and it's worth planning your expectations around that reality rather than a more dramatic alternative. Russia has weathered refinery losses, tanker disablement, and now export terminal disruption throughout this war without its economy collapsing outright. And there's no specific reason to expect Novorossiysk's troubles to be the singular tipping point that changes that broader pattern on their own. What repeated disruption here actually does, in practical terms, is compound the cumulative economic pressure we've documented building steadily across this entire series. Refineries running at reduced output, a shadow fleet increasingly exposed and now arming itself defensively, and now an export terminal handling a fifth of the country's crude sales, periodically going dark for days at a time. None of these pressures alone is likely to be decisive. Together, sustained over months and years rather than days, they represent exactly the kind of compounding attrition that tends to actually decide long wars, even when no single strike in the sequence looks decisive in isolation. To sustain a campaign like this, because it's easy to describe individual strikes without appreciating how much continuous operational capacity they actually demand. Every one of these attacks, reaching a port more than 400 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory in a straight line, requires functioning long-range drone production, reliable intelligence on where and when tankers are loading, and enough operational tempo to keep coming back to the same targets month after month, even as Russia presumably adjusts its air defenses in response to each previous strike. Russia's own Ministry of Defense claimed to have intercepted 348 drones in a single overnight period around the time of the April strike. A number worth taking with real skepticism given this war's pattern of inflated interception claims, but even a heavily discounted version of that figure suggests Russia is having to commit substantial, continuous air defense resources specifically to protecting this one port, resources that, as we discussed in our Kostiantynivka and Sloviansk episodes, aren't available for anything else while they're tied down defending Novorossiysk. So what does hit again actually mean here, as a description of an ongoing pattern rather than a single news event? It means Novorossiysk has effectively become the place where every major thread of Ukraine's economic and naval pressure campaign converges simultaneously. The refinery-adjacent strikes we covered 2 episodes back, the trapped and vulnerable fleet we documented in an earlier episode, the tanker vulnerability we discussed when covering Russia's decision to arm its own shadow fleet with machine guns, and now a terminal so consistently targeted that it's begun suspending its own operations rather than waiting for the next strike to force the issue. Every other piece of Russia's Black Sea position we've documented across this series eventually funnels back through this one port, because there simply isn't anywhere else left for it to go. Sevastopol was abandoned specifically because Novorossiysk was supposed to be safer. It isn't. And the frequency of strikes documented just across this single year makes that increasingly hard for Moscow to dispute, whatever its official statements continue to claim. None of this means Novorossiysk stops functioning entirely, and it's worth being honest about that limit the same way we have been across every other episode in this series. A fifth of Russia's oil exports and a third of its grain exports represent an enormous, strategically vital flow of revenue that Moscow will keep fighting to protect and restore, whatever the cost, because the alternative, genuinely losing this specific port's export capacity for any extended period, would compound every other economic pressure we've documented across this channel into something considerably harder to manage. But the trend across just the past 4 months is difficult to read as anything other than a port under sustained, multi-domain siege, with Russia's own operators increasingly choosing to halt operations voluntarily rather than wait for the next strike to force the same outcome by other means. Stay informed. Novorossiysk was supposed to be the place Russia's Black Sea position retreated to when everywhere else became unsafe. What's happened there just since April suggests there may not actually be anywhere left to retreat to after this. That's this week's analysis report. See you in the next one.